Yes, thank you, Anthony. And thank you for Amanda and Alison providing some good sort of background and context as well. What I'm here to talk about really myself is to talk about, I guess, the process of asking people involved in smart recovery what they thought, and to talk a bit about, and I'll hand over to Josette to do this, to talk about what we're kind of doing, what's new in smart recovery now and hopefully next year in the future. So hopefully the sort of intuitive sort of structure of my presentation, Josette's, is to sort of really talk about what smart recovery wanted to achieve, talk about who we asked and what people said, and then to finish off by talking about what we're doing. So first, a little bit of context. This is not so much recent staff appointments, but pretty much the team. Ryan McLaughlin came on board in 2013. Smart recovery began in Australia, I think, in 2004. Ryan was brought in I think near the end of 2013 as a director. Josette, who's right here, is, I would think you kind of is Smart Recovery Australia, if I can say this, has really grown it from the start, and to sort of made it what it was. I came on board as the area coordinator for South Australia, Tassie and Victoria in the middle of last year. Michael Bellamy has been, I think, joined end of last year, and he's really in charge of the digital and the online and lots of other things besides. And most recently, Peter, who's coming on board to actually help with some fundraising. The enigmatic Karen Gold has also been around for a good little while, I think she won't mind me saying, and keeps everything ticking over and working. She's our administrator. I'm not going to dwell on this too much, partly because I don't really understand these things, but we have a new board, and I know that one thing that Ryan was really keen is that, to get the governance right of Smart Australia as like a base so we can build on. So we have a great bunch of people who all bring great skills and experience. We also are very lucky, and we've heard a bit of research, and I think time is a little bit short, so I'll keep moving, but we have a research advisory committee which began in 2014, sat for the first time in 2014. So really what I'm trying to paint a picture of, Smart Recovery grew quite organically, largely in Sydney for about 10 years or so, just under perhaps. But there was a real drive to sort of bring new people on and achieve something from sort of 2013. So what were those aims and ambitions? This was my kind of first day at Smart Recovery, was at a strategic planning meeting. A lot of brainstorming, talking about what's happening at Smart Recovery and what we wanted to achieve. And some of this came out. One of the key priorities was to try and just kind of make Smart Recovery available and accessible to everyone in Australia. There was also a sense of how we can actually just, this concept we have of mutual aid, the idea that helping people and connecting people is a good thing and helps everybody involved. How can we kind of facilitate that and make that better? We're also quite conscious that material-wise, things have kind of stayed the same for a good while, and there was this is a time to have a look, to revamp a few things and revisit some of the things that program in the materials. So, just going to describe, I guess, three kind of separate ways in which we kind of went about getting some information. The first of which is the national survey, which Amanda's presented some data from already. And the second one is a specific SurveyMonkey which we put out to facilitators to ask what their thoughts about training. Training is in many ways our kind of core business. We don't run the groups as such, we train people to run the groups. That's really what we do, so this was something we wanted feedback about. There was also a series of expert interviews with people, like key people in the field, to get a sense of what they thought about Smart Recovery, what they thought the strengths and perhaps weaknesses are as well. So, the first annual survey that Dr. Pete Kelly put out and collected data from was, I think it's fair to say, that represented the first time we sort of got data about Smart Recovery. Interviews with facilitators and group members, and really the questions covered all aspects, partly to do with the tools and what we've heard about as well, but also bigger picture stuff as well. So a little bit of data and feedback from that. An interesting stat, I think, on this here is this sort of percentage of 43% of participants rated the group process as the most helpful thing. Tools was obviously an important second, but to me that sort of what it talks about is that at its heart, a really key part of it is just people coming together. And yeah, also as facilitators, interesting that they perhaps rated the tools a little bit higher. I won't deconstruct that too much right now. We also asked areas of improvement, what people thought we could do better. Encouraging, I guess, that participants felt that there are more groups, they want to be more of it. Also encouraging, I guess, that a relatively low percentage rated the facilitators, said the facilitators needed more training. I suppose that speaks hopefully with a degree of satisfaction of the facilitators. The facilitators themselves seem to identify most broadly two areas. One was a sense of getting more new content to the groups, and I think that's something we definitely take on board. Also with the training, which is also something which we, in the second round of kind of feedback, got a bit more detail. And this is where we did the Survey Monkey to ask people what they thought about the training itself. So, 114 people, about 2/3 female, majority based in New South Wales, majority currently running a group, and the majority of this sample, I noticed this is, it was a greater percentage of people who worked in the healthcare professions responded to this survey than I think the national survey. I don't have a precise figure, but I think it's quite a significant majority. The 47% I think reflects the same thing as Pete described in the survey as well. That an interesting, when we're talking about mutual aid led by people who work in the field, perhaps an interesting statistic to find out, the amount of people who have report experiencing addiction themselves. So we asked people what they liked. We broke it up into sort of practical, the role play, the theory, and the tools, which I think do comprise the kind of three core components of the training. The general feedback was that practical, the role playing helped. It's just a lot of people, when you do the training, you don't particularly enjoy role playing, but yet encouraging that people definitely do rate it as the most important thing. 50% of people who are actually now running a group reflected that this was the most useful aspect. Tools became second. 51% thought more tools would be useful. About a third people rated this as now reflected this was the most useful thing from the training. Now they're running a group. We also asked people what they thought about the duration of the training. We were really undertaking to some extent a review, and we wanted everything out on the table, and we currently run a 2-day training, face-to-face training. This was something which seemed broadly, people seemed broadly happy with most people supporting choosing 2 days. Second to that, some people, about a third people felt it could be done in 1 day. What people didn't like so much, and I think this probably does reflect the fact that there was quite a large percentage of people from the healthcare professions who responded to this, was the theory. So 80% of people thought if there's something was going to be, there could be less of, it would be theory, and only about 1 in 6 or so now thought that the theory they learned in the training was the most useful thing. We were quite mindful that in Smart Recovery UK and Smart Recovery USA, online training is quite a big part of the process. And so, in fact, in the UK, it's, for the most part, people train online. So we knew that this was something we had on our radar, something we might want to consider doing. So we asked people what they thought about that. 62% said that they thought this was, it sounded like they thought it was quite a good idea. There was broad, but not perhaps overwhelming support for post-training, continued training, but perhaps with a light touch. Most people preferring annual sort of ongoing training. Encouraging again that maybe only 1 in 6 actually identified a gap, so to speak, in the content, something they weren't getting from the training. But there was a sort of anecdotal and otherwise support for more calls for more support, I think. More contact and more refreshers, maybe, and this is something that, again, we've got on our radar. So, the last thing I'm going to talk about in terms of feedback is these kind of interviews we did with key experts. So these are people who work in the field, policymakers, people in research, and we just really asked what people thought about Smart Recovery. The general feedback was that it was a highly regarded program, and that's great, we want to hear that. I think that the brand that people associate with Smart Recovery still remains that we are the CBT 12-step, and that was definitely a lot of the feedback. I think when people asked about what they thought the challenges facing Smart Recovery were, facilitator integrity was something that people said, well, how do you know what, the facilitators, if they're doing what they should be, etc., etc. I haven't got the time to answer all of these points. there was a perception that the evidence base needed building. This is something we've talked about a bit in this symposium. So I won't dwell on that now. When it comes to the training, the general perception was that that the core was good. There was a feeling maybe that it could be a bit more experiential, interactive in some way. There was also, interestingly, a bit of feedback about the general sort of stigma mythology. This was what's seen as a challenge for smart recovery, was that mutual aid is viewed with some suspicion in some quarters by some people who work in the field, by government, by people who devise policy. I will add to that, I think, that the word recovery has a certain sort of politics, as people may be aware. I think that it's a blessing and a curse to some extent for us to have the word recovery in our title. To emphasise, of course, in Smart Recovery Australia, recovery is whatever someone wants to achieve. There are no, that's the whole essence of the programme. People come with their own goals and none are imposed. But I think nevertheless there's some misconception, and I think that a lot of people who were interviewed sort of fed that back. So that's kind of that's the feedback. I'm going to hand over to Josette to talk a bit about what's actually changed, what we're doing.
Thanks. Oh, excuse me. Thanks, David. So I'm going to talk about now what we've actually done since that we received the feedback. So the first thing that we did is we changed the training. So instead of having just a 2-day face-to-face training, we now have an online component. So that goes through all the tools, the background of smart recovery, our philosophy and so forth, and people have to answer a multiple choice question before they come to do the face-to-face training. So in that we're linking the 4 points of the program, which is the motivation, problem-solving, urges and lifestyle balance, and how the tools fit in with that, and what is the actual role of the facilitator and our expectations of a smart recovery facilitator. Excuse me. And so what this has allowed is more time for role playing, because that's what people wanted. And at the end of the day, this is what facilitators do. They are facilitating a group. So it's really important that they have a lot of practice during that 2-day face-to-face training. So we also developed new materials. So we've just done a new facilitator manual, and that's quite a comprehensive manual now. New brochures. So we did talk about, planning being so important. So our tagline now is come with a purpose and leave with a plan. So it's very simple, but that's what Smart Recovery is about. We also have a new website, and which is, again, very comprehensive. It's what probably most of our phone calls we get are people asking us where a meeting is. But the interesting thing is that they must have got our phone number off the website, but they're still asking us where a meeting is, even though we've put find a meeting on the front page. But so Michael, our digital guy, has done a really good job with that. So you can now put in a group, and I think it's within a 12-kilometre radius, a group will come up for you. There's also all the tools of the program on Smart Recovery, so you can download those and do all your exercises at home. So what the future is going to hold for us is that, and it's in the developing process at the moment, is having forums and live chats for participants so they can liaise with each other, and same with facilitators. So if facilitators having a group and it might be quite problematic, they can get online and chat with someone else, and this is what happened to me, and how did you manage that? So it's a better support system for the facilitators. And we're going to be having a newsletter, a quarterly, I think a big quarterly newsletter, and then a little monthly newsletter. So you'll be hearing lots from us. So we're hoping to, like in the UK and the US, do online meetings for rural and remote communities, or people that are socially isolated, that don't want to go to groups. again, people like in the military, that it's quite a stigma that they wouldn't disclose what they're doing, so they can go on to an online group, FIFOs, language groups and teen and youth. And I think we've heard quite a bit in this conference about teen and youth and electronics, that I think they would be more open to going on to an online group. In the US there's 35 groups, in the UK there's 5. So watch this space for 2016. So the feedback, or the summary, is that, as Amanda and Alison and David have all said, that we did this research with the facilitators and key stakeholders, and now we're starting to work on what they actually wanted to do. So we're working on that slowly but surely. So I'd like to thank you all.